In 1981, the world watched as Lady Diana Spencer married Prince Charles in what seemed like a modern fairy tale. But hidden within Diana's ancestry lay a bloodline that had been systematically erased from power for over 4 centuries. This is the story of how Tudor blood, once deemed too dangerous for the English throne, quietly made its way back through one of history's most deliberate acts of defiance. The story begins in 1514, not with Diana, but with Mary Tudor, the youngest sister of King Henry VIII. At 18 years old, Mary was considered one of the most beautiful women in Europe. Her brother adored her, but like all royal women of her time, she was a political asset. Henry arranged her marriage to King Louis XII of France, a man in his 50s whose health was rapidly failing. The alliance would strengthen England's position in Europe. Mary's feelings were irrelevant. The marriage lasted exactly 82 days. When Louis died in January 1515, Mary found herself a widow in a foreign court, surrounded by suspicion and political intrigue, according to diplomatic correspondence from the period. The French court immediately began speculating about her next marriage, viewing her as a valuable prize in European politics. But Mary had made a promise before leaving England. She had fallen in love with Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, one of Henry's closest companions. Brandon was not royal, but he had risen through skill and charm to become one of the most powerful men at court. Before Mary departed for France, she and Charles had exchanged a secret vow. If fate left her a widow, she would marry him. When Henry sent Charles to France to escort his sister home, he gave him explicit instructions. Historians have documented these orders through multiple contemporary sources. Henry trusted Charles completely and expected him to return Mary to England unmarried, where the king could arrange her next political alliance. What happened next changed the course of English history. In a small chapel near Paris, with only a handful of witnesses present, Mary and Charles married in secret. They knew the consequences. To marry a king's sister without permission was not merely disobedience, it was treason. The penalty was death. Contemporary accounts describe their terror during the voyage back to England. They drafted multiple letters to Henry, offering their entire fortunes, pleading for mercy, explaining their actions through professions of love that seem remarkably modern in their emotional directness. Mary wrote that she had fulfilled her duty in her first marriage, and begged her brother to allow her this one choice for herself. Henry's rage, when news reached him, was absolute. According to court records and diplomatic dispatches, the king felt personally betrayed. This wasn't just political disobedience. His closest friend and his beloved sister had conspired to make him look foolish before all of Europe, but Henry did not execute them. Instead, he devised a punishment that would last generations. Charles and Mary were forced to repay Mary's entire French dowry, financially crippling them. They had to remarry publicly before the court, kneeling to beg the king's forgiveness in a ceremony designed to humiliate them. Most significantly, Henry made clear that their children would live under his control. Their marriage would be tolerated, but their descendants would never be free. Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon had 2 daughters who survived to adulthood, Frances and Eleanor. These girls grew up in a strange position. They were granddaughters of King Henry VII, nieces of a reigning king, yet they were effectively prisoners of royal favor. Every aspect of their lives required Henry's approval. Frances, the elder daughter, was married to Henry Grey, Marquis of Dorset, in an arranged match that kept the family under crown control. This marriage produced 3 daughters, Lady Jane Grey, Lady Catherine Grey, and Lady Mary Grey. Through these girls, Mary Tudor's bloodline continued, but the curse she and Charles had triggered by their defiance had only begun. The most famous of these granddaughters was Lady Jane Grey, remembered as England's 9-day queen. Jane was a brilliant scholar who wanted nothing to do with power. But in 1553, after the death of the young King Edward VI, Protestant nobles, desperate to prevent the Catholic Mary Tudor from taking the throne, placed Jane on it instead. She was 16 years old, terrified, and completely aware that she was a pawn in a deadly game. 9 days later, Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's daughter, marched on London with overwhelming support. Jane's brief reign collapsed. Within months, Jane was executed. She was 17 years old when she died on the scaffold, a direct descendant of Henry VIII's sister, killed because that very bloodline made her too dangerous to live. Lady Jane Grey's execution in 1554 should have ended the threat posed by Mary Tudor's descendants. But bloodlines persist in unexpected ways, and the story of this forbidden marriage would continue to haunt English history for centuries. Jane's younger sisters, Catherine and Mary Grey, carried the same dangerous inheritance. Under Queen Elizabeth I, who never married and refused to name an heir, anyone with Tudor blood became an automatic focus of political intrigue. Catherine was considered by many to have a legitimate claim to the throne as a senior descendant of Henry VII. Catherine made the same mistake her great-grandmother had made. She married for love. Her secret marriage to Edward Seymour, when discovered, sent Elizabeth into a fury reminiscent of Henry VIII. The Queen declared the marriage invalid and imprisoned Catherine, moving her from castle to castle and ensuring she never saw her husband again. Catherine died at 27, officially of illness, though contemporary accounts suggest she wasted away from grief and harsh conditions. Even Mary Grey, the youngest sister who was born with physical disabilities that the court assumed made her harmless, was punished for marrying beneath her station. She too was placed under house arrest, separated from her husband for years, dying in relative obscurity. The message from the crown was clear and consistent across generations. This bloodline would never be allowed near power again. Catherine Grey's children were declared illegitimate by Elizabeth's decree, despite their parents' marriage. Their descendants were systematically pushed away from any royal proximity, becoming country gentry, minor landowners, and eventually fading from aristocratic prominence entirely. For over 2 centuries, the descendants of Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon disappeared into the middle ranks of English society. The Tudor blood thinned and spread through marriages to untitled families. By the 18th century, their royal ancestry was little more than a genealogical curiosity, mentioned in family trees but carrying no practical significance. Yet genealogical records show that this bloodline persisted through a family called Spencer. The Spencers were successful and wealthy, building their fortune through sheep farming and land management during the 16th and 17th centuries. They were respectable but not remarkable. Over generations of careful marriages and social climbing, they earned an earldom and became part of England's aristocratic establishment. Deep in their family tree, documented through multiple genealogical sources including the extensive research conducted for Diana's wedding, ran a direct line back to Frances Brandon, daughter of Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon. The blood of the forbidden marriage had survived, quiet and unnoticed, for over 400 years. In 1961, Frances Ruth Roach gave birth to a daughter and named her Diana Frances Spencer. That middle name was a family tradition, passed down from their Brandon ancestor. Diana grew up as the daughter of an earl, but the family's royal connections were distant at best. She worked as a kindergarten assistant, living a relatively ordinary upper-class life, until her engagement to Prince Charles in 1981. The world celebrated what it saw as a commoner marrying into royalty. But genealogically speaking, this was something else entirely. Through Diana, the bloodline that Henry VIII had tried to suppress, that Elizabeth I had imprisoned and disinherited, that successive monarchs had pushed further and further from power, was returning to the heart of the monarchy. Diana's sons, William and Harry, carry this ancestry. When Prince William eventually becomes king, he will be the first British monarch since Henry VIII to carry the blood of Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon. The genetic legacy of that forbidden marriage in a French chapel, the bloodline deemed too dangerous for the throne, will finally sit upon it. Historical analysis suggests this return is entirely coincidental. There was no conspiracy, no deliberate plot. The Spencers married into various aristocratic families over centuries, and Diana's selection as Charles's bride had nothing to do with her distant Tudor ancestry. Yet the irony remains striking. Mary Tudor chose love over duty and spent the rest of her life paying for that choice. Her descendants were executed, imprisoned, stripped of titles, and pushed into obscurity. For over 400 years, the crown ensured that this bloodline would never threaten the throne again. But genealogy follows its own logic, indifferent to royal decrees. Through patient centuries and countless marriages, through the Brandons to the Greys to the Spencers, that bloodline endured. When Diana walked down the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral in 1981, she carried with her the genetic echo of a 16-year-old girl's desperate act of defiance in 1515. History rarely moves in straight lines. Sometimes it moves in circles so vast that centuries pass before the pattern becomes visible. The forbidden marriage of Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon was punished across generations. But in the end, history had the final word.